Hi guys, welcome to Spring 2020. This is Endocrinology, which we usually do on Mondays. This is part of the GIGU class. And yeah, welcome back. Sorry I can't be there in person, but hopefully in the near future this will all change. But for right now, everything's going to be online. And without further ado, let's get started on this. I would mention that we will meet this afternoon for anybody who wants to ask questions or talk about anything. But I should have this lecture already posted, hopefully by then. All right, here we go. So I built this program using some really good endocrinology books. You don't need to buy these, though. My notes are very comprehensive. In fact, these are my teaching notes. But if you need some reference sources, Goodman is a classic one. Maurice Goodman. These two are a little bit more in depth, but they're I really like both of these as well. This is 7th edition. This is James Endocrinology, and this is Williams. So I use all three of these books to make this series. So here we go. What is endocrinology? It's basically the science of the study of hormones and how those hormones spread throughout the body. It's also a branch of molecular biology. And hormones, one thing you should know, an AKA for hormone is ligand. So I assume you know that. If not, add that to your vocabulary list. Because in the test, if I say, what ligand does this? And you don't know what a ligand is, I'm not going to tell you what a ligand is. So make sure you know what that is. But hormones are ligands. They're substances that travel through the bloodstream, and they bind with their receptor, which is sometimes very far away, sometimes it's not so far away. Typically, that receptor is either on the cell membrane itself or it's inside the nucleus. So it's typically far away, classically speaking, but it doesn't have to be. Maybe it's just next door or a couple cells over. Therefore, a hormone does have a paracrine function. When a hormone doesn't use the bloodstream, but instead uses the interstitium and kind of swims over there to its receptor, that's called paracrine action, or it's classified as a paracrine hormone. If maybe the hormone turns around and binds to a receptor that's on the cell that's on itself, the same cell that made it. So that's an autocrine type of hormone. Okay. Another concept is hormones only bind to the receptor they're made for. I think that's pretty basic. If you have hormone A that has this little triangular shaped receptor binding site, well, it only binds here to these receptors. But hormone B is round. It can't bind to the cell at all because it doesn't fit anywhere. That's a pretty simple example. Some receptors can actually bind to more than one hormone. As long as it has a receptor, it doesn't care who the cell is or where the cell is. It can bind to it. Here's just an example of a ligand or a hormone binding to a receptor on the cell surface. And that causes a chain reaction within the cells. Different pathways can be set into motion, which ultimately has a molecule that goes inside the nucleus, turns on some genes. The genes make a mRNA. They come out, get transcribed by a ribosome, and you get a gene product, which could be a hormone or it could be a protein of some kind, all sorts of things. But that's kind of how this works. Also interesting that steroid hormones typically don't bind to a cell surface receptor because they're hydrophobic. Just like the lipid bilayer, they can penetrate without any type of receptor, and they'll bind to their receptor will be on the nucleus. Kind of talked about this already, hormone versus paracrine versus autocrine. Hormone does not always use the bloodstream to move around the body, as we said. Sometimes it can swim. I mean, it doesn't swim, right? It doesn't have arms or anything, but it can diffuse and move through the interstitium. What is the interstitium, by the way? Well, interstitium is, if this is a cell here, here's another cell here. Here is a capillary driving by. You'll learn this is why I don't draw on the board. But let's say we have, let's say a nitrogen. These cells are hungry for nitrogen. It comes out of the blood, the proximal part of the capillary. How does it get over to the cell? Well, it swims, it diffuses through this stuff. And all this stuff here is called the interstitium, right? Or interstitial fluid makes up the interstitium. So that's the concept. Maybe this cell just makes a hormone. And maybe it's going to act as a paracrine, and it's going to go over here. But it's going to move through the interstitial fluid to reach its buddy. Cells have to be embedded in something, right? You learned a lot about basement membranes and lamina propria, but cells don't just float around. They have to be anchored in something. And the cells of the interstitium often are just floating around in the interstitium. Or maybe there's a basement membrane here anchoring them down. But the interstitium is super important for feeding. That's how they get their oxygen, their nitrogen, their glucose. And the waste is removed, right? And we have waste coming out of this cell. Maybe it's acid or who knows what it is, lactate. And it goes in here in the distal capillary. Proximal capillary drives things out. And we'll talk about this when the time comes. And that's another rule of mine. When I make a test, if it ain't on these PowerPoint slides, I'm not going to test you on it. So even if I draw this right here, I'm not going to test you on that. But I know this is coming further on down the road in CVPP class. But that's what an interstitium is. So that's important. Okay, we talked about paracrine signaling. We talked about autocrine already, so I don't need to repeat those things. And here's just kind of better than what I've drawn here. So here's a arterial. Does anybody know what this is called? What is this called? Forget the green stuff for right now. Well, arterial, venual, capillary. There's a word for all these three things. This is called the microcirculation. We talk a lot about the microcirculation. This is where blood pressure is controlled, right? In the arterioles and in the venules. So here's the setup. Now what's the green stuff? Those are lymphatics, right? These are called lymph capillaries. Everywhere there's a capillary in the body, there's a lymph capillary system. Notice they're blind-ended, right? They're not continuous. They don't have a end. What do? They drain off excess interstitial fluid, and we'll talk about that in CVPP when we talk about swelling. But here's some cells sitting in what's this kind of tan stuff? That's the interstitium. And so that's what hormones and things have to swim through that in order to get to their cells. What would happen if you have too much capillary permeability from something? You got burned really bad, and it destroyed these capillaries, and they're leaking like crazy. What happens to the interstitium? It gets way too full of fluid. Then what happens to the glucose that has to go all the way over here? It has trouble swimming that far, and the cells start to die. So that's just, and we'll come to that, but that's just an example of how this interstitium is really important. And we talked about this, autocrine, the hormones are released from this cell. They turn right back around. They swim a little bit through the interstitium, and they bind to receptors on themselves. That's autocrine signaling. Paracrine we talked about. Here's a neighbor cell. They just swim over to that and bind on it. Here's a cell maybe way up in the brain. Maybe these are some liver cells here. Or maybe pancreas secreting insulin. So it's secreted. They're a long way away from the brain, but so in order to get there, they have to jump in this highway. They can't swim all the way there. So they jump in the blood vessel, and they're transported all the way to their capillary system around these cells, wherever they may be, and they swim over through the interstitium again. They can't get away from that going in the interstitium, and they bind to their target cells. All right, kind of some fun facts about this stuff. So a blood traveling hormone Z. So if you have one hormone floating in the blood, and then you have an interstitial hormone Z, so you have the same hormone. The point of this slide is if you have the same hormone and it binds to neighbor cells on the same receptors, those cells will often impart a different effect as a result of that stimulation. The cells that travel longer through the blood, they bind to the same receptors, but those cells will have a different reaction. So it's kind of weird. We don't really understand why that is. But even though they have the same receptor, they can make different effects by different cells. Perfect example is testosterone. So testosterone in the bloodstream stimulates protein synthesis in muscles, right? That's why bodybuilders and some athletes use this stuff so they can train harder and recover faster and train harder again. Stimulates the muscles to build and recover faster. So that's what it does when it binds to muscle receptors. But that same molecule of testosterone, when it binds to type A dark spermatogonia, remember those from Dr. Doe days? When it binds to those during puberty, it stimulates the process of spermatogenesis. We're going to make new little sperm. I just posted an embryology video. If you're weak on embryology, by the way, one good thing is, we'll see how long I can hold up, but I'm trying to put my embryology videos and my spinal anatomy videos up on this same website. So you got boards coming not too far in the future, so you might want to review some of that stuff if you don't know about spermatogenesis, for example. Okay. Endocrine versus exocrine is another concept, pretty simple. So endocrine glands do not secrete their hormones into any type of duct system. So they secrete right into the interstitium, and their product, whether it be a hormone or whatever, it swims a little bit and jumps right into the capillary system. Then it's off to the races. So these are more likely to be pure hormones. Example is pituitary, thyroid, pancreas. Exocrine glands, on the other hand, they secrete right into a duct system. They don't secrete into an interstitium. So salivary glands are perfect example. I'm sure you remember what heptocrine is. If not, well, we're going to talk about that, because if you have a mutation in the gene that makes heptocrine, what happens? You get pernicious anemia. You can't absorb vitamin B12 in the distal ileum. So we'll look at that system. But that's an example. Heptocrine is secreted right into a ductal system. Ready? Let's see. It's the ducts drain the duct, like the parotid gland, drains heptocrine right into the bolus of food you're chewing up. So it doesn't go into the bloodstream and do anything. It's not a hormone. Okay, there are 5 classes of hormones. Now, you see the stars? I'm getting a little excited here. Let me tell you the deal with the stars. And it's kind of a mess by this point. I've had this class, I've been teaching it for so long. But when I make a question, I make a new test every quarter. And when I'm reviewing, I always review my slides before class. And when my brain goes, oh yeah, that was on the last quarter's test, I put a star. So when you start to see tons of stars like this is pretty important stuff. People always ask me, what do I study? There's so many slides. Well, look for where I go crazy with the stars, or where I tell you, oh, this is probably going to be on boards and probably going to be on my test. When I say something like that, that's good stuff to study right now. All right, so here's the 5 classes of hormones. We have amino acids. Thyroid hormones are classic. We have neuropeptides like vasopressin. We have insulin, our very large proteins. Steroids like cortisol, aldosterone, estrogen. And vitamin D and A are hormones. Basic hormone rules. So amino acid and peptide hormones typically bind with their receptors, which live on the outer cell membrane of a cell. So because they bind to the cell membrane, they don't have any direct effect on protein synthesis. They can't affect the genes directly that are inside the nucleus, right? Because they just bound to the outside of the cell. So they have to rely on a second messenger signaling pathway to get the job done. Now, vitamin D and other large protein and steroid hormones, they are super hydrophobic. They don't like water, but the lipid bilayer of a cell is hydrophobic. So they can easily penetrate right through that cell membrane, and they don't need a receptor. Their receptors are on the nucleus, on the nuclear membrane. All right, simple concept. Some other fun facts. So most hormones are released in a rhythmic type fashion, usually late at night or early in the morning. There's a circadian rhythm to the release of certain hormones. And that can be influenced by things like sunlight coming up, like time change, right? When we change the time, it kind of messes people up for a while. Or if you fly to a different time zone, if you fly across the country or 3 hours behind, or I guess what would it be? New York, 3 hours ahead of us. That messes up your circadian rhythms. Hormones are also, they're not released, they don't steadily drip their hormone product into the bloodstream. They're usually pulsatile. They're blasts or squirts of the hormone will come out, like ACTH. Really, POMC is converted into ACTH. But POMC is kind of blasted out and relaxes. So everything is pulsatile in nature. Feedback cycles are important. So there's negative and positive feedback cycles. Most hormones are negative feedback controlled. That's a very simple concept where the hormone that is released, when it builds up to a certain point, it's actually able to shut off the cells that make it. So that's called a negative feedback cycle. So perfect example we'll talk about more is cortisol actually has a double negative feedback system for the release of ACTH. Once cortisol levels get high enough, they shut down the hypothalamus and they shut down the anterior pituitary to stop making cortisol or the products that stimulate cortisol production. So that's a double negative. We'll get into that stuff. I'm not going to go. I want to try not to make this too long. Positive feedback cycle. There are a few of them to dealing with pregnancy. Most of them, like oxytocin, stimulates when delivery happens. Some signals are released. Oxytocin stimulates the uterine wall to contract really hard. It actually is painful. The harder the muscle contracts, the more oxytocin is released. More oxytocin causes even harder contractions. They ramp up and get very painful. Perfect example of a positive feedback cycle. Prolactin is another one for the baby suckling, stimulates the release of more prolactin, which makes more milk produce, and that makes the baby be able to suck harder and longer, which stimulates more prolactin, and so you get a positive feedback cycle. And then there's the interplay between estrogen, stimulates the release of luteinizing hormone, which stimulates the release of more estrogen. That's part of the menstruation cycle, right? And that's another example. That would be a good question, right? I don't have any stars on here because I just put that slide in this morning. But what a great question. Anytime you see three things like this, it's so easy for me to make a question. I write board-style questions for you, so there'll be all multiple choice. There will be 4 answer choices, just like on boards. Classic question is the following are examples. All of the following are examples of positive feedback cycles except blank. And so you got to fill in the blank. So oxytocin, prolactin, estrogen, and stuff like that. So got to think like a teacher. Think like you got to write the test. How would you write that test? All right, let's talk about the pituitary gland. So it's also called the hypophysis cerebri by Standring, which is that giant, thick, black-covered Gray's Anatomy book. That is one of the Board of Chiropractic Examiners books. So that's an AKA, so watch out for that one. So it's kind of a grayish-red structure. It lives in that little cave, the sella turcica, is that little cave we talked about. We talked about all the parts of that, right, in Gross 2. The front and the back, the saddle, right? It's covered by a diaphragmatic cella. That should be diaphragmatic. Yeah, that's diaphragmatic. It should be. So that's wrong. Diaphragmatic cella as part of the dura. Remember, it's not completely covered though. Remember seeing these in gross 2. The sella turcica would be into the plane of the page. Pituitary stalk would be right here. It's connecting to the hypothalamus, which has been cut. But that's the diaphragmatic cella right there. And that's the covering kind of to the top of that thing. The diaphragmatic cella transmits the infundibulum, which is part of the posterior pituitary. It's the pituitary stalk, but it's considered part of the... Is it the posterior? I think it's the posterior pituitary. I have a slide coming up on that. Okay, it's separated from the floor of the sella turcica. So pituitary is separated. There's a venous plexus underneath it. So hormones can be dumped quickly into this venous plexus and take off when they're released from the pituitary. It connects superiorly with the infundibulum, which is the pituitary stalk, and then the medium eminence is above the pituitary stalk. That's still part of the pituitary. The median eminence is what connects to the hypothalamus. Which one of the following connects to the hypothalamus directly? So I see the question coming. The infundibulum? No. Connects to the medium eminence. How about the medium eminence? Yeah, that connects directly to the hypothalamus. I could say some silly word. There's an anterior lobe called the adenohypophysis and a posterior lobe called the neurohypophysis. Let's take a look at them here. So here's the setup. So here we have the posterior pituitary here. Sometimes it's called the pars nervosa. And we have the pars distalis, pars intermedia, pars tuberalis. These are parts of the 3 parts of the anterior pituitary gland. And see the infundibulum, I guess it does connect. It holds, it supports the anterior and posterior lobe, but it's actually part of it anyway, is a continuation of the posterior pituitary. Underneath it here, there's that kind of venous plexus I drew in there. But there's another venous plexus we'll look at in a minute. Pituitary, of course, is called the master gland because it controls your motions, it controls, you name it, it controls it. It's super, super important. The main job, the 3 main jobs, it has control over the thyroid, the adrenal gland, and the testes or ovaries, gonads if you want to say those collectively. But here's this is pretty cool. We'll look at these supraoptic nuclei and paraventricular nuclei here in a second. This is the hypothalamus here, medium eminence is here, hypothalamus or the pituitary stalk is right in here. And we can see one weird thing. So the anterior pituitary doesn't have any of these little sticks. What are these little sticks? Kind of looks like the root of a tree, doesn't it? And there's the tree trunk, and there's the tree. Well, these are nerves. So the posterior pituitary works via nerves. There's not a lot of blood vessels that go down here. There are a couple, but there's not many. It works on nerves, and we'll come into that here in a minute. This is a good slide to test on. Some of the main hormones that come out of the pituitary. So ACTH, what does that stimulate? This would be an easy type of a board question, kind of a softball. You cannot miss these softball questions. It's okay if you miss the super hard ones. Those are kind of, there's not many of those, but there's a lot of softball questions you can't miss, and this is one of them. So this slide should be memorized. I think you know it already. Adrenal corticotropic hormone, ACTH, stimulates the adrenal cortex. We'll look at the layers that it stimulates specific. We're really going to get into that one. Growth hormone stimulates muscles, amongst other things. Melanocyte stimulating hormone stimulates melanocytes to make melanin. If this gets overexcited in some types of adrenal problems, you can get a bronzing of the skin. We'll talk about Addison's disease. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid. We have the gonadotropins, FSH stimulates the testes, LH stimulates the ovary. Oxytocin, prolactin both stimulate the breast and uterus. Could put that in there as well. We're going to talk a lot about ADH. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, stimulates the nephron to do what? Anybody know? Yeti, do you know? I think you're about, are you in this class? I think I saw you subscribed, so I can pick on you for a while. You're right. It stimulates the reabsorption of free water. What about sodium? Doesn't sodium follow water? Not when ADH is concerned. So there's an uptake of free water without sodium, which is weird, right? Aldosterone causes the uptake of water and sodium, but not ADH, and we'll get to that more. Remember I said if it's not written in stone, you don't have to worry about it yet, but it will be written in stone pretty soon. Regulation. So pituitary gland is regulated by three things. It has hypothalamic factors and controls like CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. Goes down and stimulates corticotroph cells to release POMC, which immediately is converted into ACTH. We'll look at that. We have feedback effects, positive and negative, mostly negative feedback effects. And then we have paracrine and autocrine action can also regulate the pituitary release of hormones. The anterior lobe, again, is called adrenal hypophysis, can be broken down into three parts. We already looked at these, the pars distalis, the anterior portion, pars intermedia. Now, humans really don't have much, just more, but other animals do. So we really have two functioning lobes of the anterior pituitary. Pars tuberculosis is the posterior portion. Now, am I likely to ask a question on that? I might, but it's set up for 3, but only 1 star. I'm not very super excited about that. That's getting pretty darn picky. But you never know. Posterior lobe can be broken up into 3 parts as well. Pars nervosa, that's the posterior lobe or the neural lobe. There's the infundibular stalk. And then there's the median eminence. These are all parts of the posterior lobe. I bet you didn't know the median eminence was part of the posterior lobe. But now you do. Here's another diagram showing kind of looked at something similar to this. But you can see these tracks. We're going to talk about these tracks here in a minute because this is the hypothalamus region. And you got to know these 2 nuclei, right? The supraoptic nuclei, paraventricular nuclei or nucleus. Nuclei is plural. So these are 2 regions that are very busy. We'll talk about these magnocellular neurons, the type of neurons. We'll come to that, though. I'm going to take it easy. We're not going to go too much longer today. Anterior pituitary, most of its cells are secretory. So secretes hormones or prohormones like PMOC, which is the precursor of ACTH. Cells are arranged in cords. They're surrounded by a capillary system as well. So hormones, once they're made from these cells, they jump right into the bloodstream really quickly. We already know the anterior pituitary is linked to the hypothalamus, not by a nerve system, but this is a flat-out vessel system. It has a name, of course. The hypothalamic comes from the hypothalamus to the hypophyseal. That means pituitary, and it's a portal-like system, so it's more of a venous-type system. So basically, that's a fancy word for saying it's a venous system around the hypothalamus and pituitary. Okay, here's an example of that system. If we butterfly open the pituitary, we can see all the venous system. Yeah, everything I said. So portal blood, the arrangement of this blood vessel is important. Portal blood first picks up chemical signals from the hypothalamus and then delivers them to the anterior pituitary. Perfect example is, we'll study a lot, this CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, is produced. And it goes down, it stimulates corticotroph cells to make POMC, which make ACTH. So hypothalamic hormones will immediately be taken up by this system. So they're made up in some cells up here, and they're jumping the system, and they're immediately shot down here where they go out into the interstitium and hit their target cell, corticotroph cells for our little example here. And the binding of CRH causes corticotrophs to crank out a prohormone called POMC, which is immediately converted by PC1 into ACTH. That stuff's coming. All right. Yep. Posterior pituitary. We already talked about this. Unlike the anterior lobe, posterior pituitary is super thick with non-myelinated nerve fibers, and they have the ability to transport hormones down them. So the hormones are actually made in the hypothalamus and then transported inside of these nerves. So just like blood vessels, some types of nerve, non-myelinated fiber, can also transport hormones. That's exactly what happens. Okay, so it's important. The secretion of hormones or prohormones does not occur physically in the posterior pituitary. It's in the hypothalamus that this occurs. Here comes the cell bodies. I'm getting more excited by the stars. So with regard to the posterior pituitary, who makes the hormones from there? Well, there's two. There's two nuclei. Mainly, they're made from magnocellular neurons, which are really big, which are located in two places. The supraoptic nuclei and the paraventricular nuclei have these. They have regular neurons as well, like most nerves do, but they have these gigantic ones called magnocellular neurons. And magnocellular neurons, that's where ADH comes from, antidiuretic hormone. Okay, they also make oxytocin as well. So magnocellular neurons are really, really important. Not good to have a mutation in the magnocellular neurons. Causes problems, which we'll talk about. So the cell bodies of the magnocellular neurons synthesize hormonal materials transported down the axon through the infundibulum, and it can be stored there too. It's not like, oh, okay, we got to make it up in the thalamus and then we got to transport it all the way down. Nope, it's made constantly, and then it's stored in these nerve endings in the posterior pituitary. So when the signal arises, it can immediately be squirted out. Right? The capillaries in this region are I shouldn't say super leaky. They're like medium leaky. So bottom line is they do get in. There's not a lot of transporters. They're not stingy. They can get in pretty easily. Remember a little flashback from our capillaries. Boards love this stuff, right? You remember this from Dr. Doe's days probably. Really stingy. So in fat in the nervous system, blood-brain barrier has these continuous capillaries, and the blood would be inside this tube, and here's the epithelial cells. There's nowhere to get out. But these weird fenestrated capillaries, they're pretty tight, but they have holes in them. And so they're leaky. Things can leak through. These are ridiculously leaky. These are called discontinuous capillaries found in the liver and the bone marrow. And they're just the huge gaps between the cells. Whole red blood cells can go out through these if need be. Okay, a little more excited with the stars here. So 7 anterior pituitary hormones. So you need to know these. Sometimes you call them trophic hormones or tropic hormones, but here they are. So if you don't know these, easy, almost guaranteed a question. Super easy for me to make a question of these. Thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, right? FSH, TSH. I didn't put the abbreviations. You probably know these already. Luteinizing hormone, LH. Growth hormone, GH, sometimes called somatotropic hormone. Prolactin, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, sometimes just called corticotropin by itself. One weird one called beta-lipoprotein. We don't really know a lot about that yet. There's some theory on it, but we're not going to go that crazy into that. 2 hormones of the posterior pituitary, you already know these, I think. ADH, we're going to talk a lot about this one. You know the AKAs. You know this one, vasopressin. You don't know this one, arginine vasopressin is another AKA. They use this one when ADH is being cranked out in large, when someone's really got a problem with bleeding. ADH is being cranked out in large amounts. They call it arginine vasopressin at that point, just to kind of give people an idea, oh God, there's a lot of ADH being produced. We'll talk about that more when the time comes. Causes the kidneys to conserve water. What's that mean, conserve? That means it's stingy, or in this case, the body's stingy. It wants the water back that it lost at the proximal part of the nephron, but not sodium. Sodium is kind of given the hand, stay out, sodium. Kind of weird, right? Sodium usually follows water. And then oxytocin, we talked a little bit about that, helps with breast milk production, stimulates the more production. The suckling reflex causes more production of oxytocin, etc. And it causes uterine contractions as well. All right. Oh no, the dreaded R2A system. That's probably enough for our first day, so we'll stop it right there. And I will upload these slides to Brightspace, and I will upload this video to YouTube. And what else do I need to say? That's about it for now. See you guys in the next lecture.